Dr. Roberts' eyes had become wild, almost possessed. The friendly, skeptical Dr. Roberts I'd first met was gone, replaced by one who was completely convinced I was telling the truth. Now he was going to cash in on it, no matter what. "Doug, you were honest with me, and I'll be honest with you," he said. "You'll never leave here." Hello, welcome back to WordWise. I'm Kit, and today we'll be talking about Chad Daybell's second Mormon doomsday time travel novel, Doug's Dilemma. It's the sequel to An Errand for Emma, and the second book in the Emma trilogy. Terrible name for a trilogy, by the way. If you're wondering why I'm analyzing Chad Daybell's writing, please watch my first video on An Errand for Emma, linked below. The Emma trilogy is about an LDS family named the Daltons, and their daughter Emma, and their son Doug, Double D Dalton. In the first book in the trilogy, Emma hit her head so hard that she was catapulted 130 years into the past, where she undertook a long, dangerous journey among the evil non-Mormons to retrieve some important historical paperwork, outwit the Three Stooges, and terrify people with her unholy moonwalk. When the second book begins, Emma has just married her boyfriend, Tad. But this story is narrated by her brother, Doug, Double D Dalton. He's right here on the cover, looking like he's listening to someone explain why he can't park in a fire lane. Let's begin. I pressed my face against the airplane window, awaiting my first glimpse of New York City. We'd been flying south above the Hudson River, and Manhattan's skyscrapers were beginning to appear on the horizon. "You'll see the Empire State Building any second," said the bearded businessman seated next to me. "I never get bored with this landing. It's quite a sight." I watched as the green expanse of Central Park came into view, followed by the Empire State Building. The southern tip of Manhattan Island finally became visible as it jutted into New York Harbor, with the World Trade Center's twin towers dominating the skyline. I could barely believe my eyes. "Wow, they're gigantic," I said in awe. As I mentioned in my video on Chad's first novel, Chad has no real creativity. He takes all of his ideas from somewhere. Things he's read, people he knows, his own life, Marvel movies, the Book of Mormon. Pretty sure there's some Back to the Future thrown in there. And there's an extent to which all authors do this. We take ideas and ingest them and combine them and transform them into something original. Creativity can't occur in a void. What's unusual about Chad is the degree to which he transforms these ideas. By which I mean, he barely transforms them at all. The first 50 pages of this book are directly taken from Chad's life. I know, because he wrote the same stories in his autobiography, Living on the Edge of Heaven. I will point them out along the way. So on the first page here, Doug is flying to Newark Airport to begin his Mormon mission. In case you don't know, 75% of young people in the LDS Church serve a mission, which lasts 2 years for men and 18 months for women. I don't know why there's a discrepancy there. If you've had Mormons show up on your doorstep, then you've met some of these missionaries. Doug is flying from Utah to Newark, and out the plane window, he sees the World Trade Center. This book was published in 2000, but Chad served his actual mission in the late 80s. In either case, the Twin Towers were still standing. Here is a picture of him posing with them in the background. I mention this because Chad has an odd obsession with the World Trade Center. It appears he always has. He never misses an opportunity to mention them in his writing. Now let's get one thing clear. Doug is Chad. Chad later claimed that Doug was based on one of his sons, which would make Chad Doug's father Mark. But that's a lie. It's very obvious that Doug is the character Chad resonates with, and he gives Doug all of his own life experiences, which would seem to be a sign. In the book, Doug has been called to serve his mission among the Spanish-speaking people of Newark, New Jersey. Before I'd left Utah, I'd talked with a returned missionary who'd served among New Jersey's Spanish-speaking people. He told me how much fun he'd had there, and he explained that only a fourth of the missionaries in New Jersey spoke Spanish. The rest of the missionaries worked with the English-speaking population. "You'll love serving in the Spanish areas," he said. You'll get to teach more discussions, as well as see a lot of baptisms. From the start, Doug is nervous about serving in New Jersey. It sounded great, but some of his comments made me nervous. It's fairly safe overall, he said, although parts of Newark still look like a battle zone. From what? I asked. The civil rights riots of the 1960s, he said. Some areas were never cleaned up. Wow, I said. We stay out of those parts, right? He chuckled. I'm afraid not. Don't worry, though. You'll get used to the persecution. Persecution? I asked. Like what? Teenagers would shout vulgar names at us, and sometimes they'd throw bottles or try to pick a fight, he said. You're tall, though. You'll intimidate them. I didn't like his logic. Isn't a taller target an easier target? Yeah, the word persecution is used repeatedly in this story to describe people who react negatively to having missionaries bother them. Chad seems to have genuine difficulty understanding why they don't want strangers banging on doors in their neighborhood. Doug is met at the airport by some other missionaries, and they get on the highway. Now, I want to drop in a little bit of psychology from Chad's autobiography. I dated a nice girl a few times that I'd met in my Communications 101 class, but we didn't really click. She was from Florida, and on our final date, she said, "Sorry, but you need to get out and see the world. There's more to life than Utah Valley." I was slightly offended. I mean, I'd been to Disneyland 3 times with my family, and one time I'd walked about a mile into Tijuana, Mexico. Then there was the trip to the Four Corners Monument, where I'd stood in 4 different states at the same time. What did she mean I hadn't seen the world? I was about to find out. I honestly don't know if he meant that ironically or not, but it's immediately clear that Chad Doug is very naive. Going to Disneyland is the exact opposite of seeing the world. It's spending time in an incredibly fake world. And this Tijuana thing reminds me of the time my friend's dad drove us into Canada so we could buy cherry Cokes at a gas station and then drove us back to Michigan. I mean, yeah, it was cool that the Coke can said Coke Cerise, but it didn't exactly make me a sophisticated world traveler. Doug arrives in Newark and just goes into shock at the sight of the city. I couldn't believe how crowded everything was. The freeway was lined with commercial buildings as far as I could see, and every overpass we went under was jammed with cars. Elder Price pointed out a few historical sites, but I was too overwhelmed to really listen to him as I wondered what I'd gotten myself into. I definitely felt insignificant among these millions of people. I was literally a nobody. I wasn't used to that. It's nice that he spells out his narcissism for us here. I was literally a nobody. I wasn't used to that. No, I'm sure Double D wasn't. The chapter then goes into a flashback, just like the first novel did. Exactly why Chad keeps opening books this way, I don't know. I think what he's attempting is to start the story with something exciting, which is smart, in theory. You want your story to grab a reader's attention, you want the opening hook. But Emma falling down some stairs without injuring herself and Chad flying into Newark just aren't exciting enough to intrigue readers. I've flown into Newark. It's not exactly the mecca of the universe. Anyway, we go back in time to several months prior when Doug received the info packet telling him where he'd be serving. You remember how the main character in the Book of Mormon musical was sure he'd get sent to Orlando and instead he got sent to Uganda? This is the exact opposite situation. I'd taken 2 years of Spanish in high school, so I'd expected my destination to be a warm Latin American country. I wasn't too worried about where I'd serve, as long as it was exotic. Well, it's New Jersey. Thus ends Chapter 1. Chapter 2 continues the flashbacks. I thought about skipping this chapter in my recap because it has nothing to do with the rest of the book. But you could say that about the first 50 pages, and frankly, this chapter demonstrates Chad's abnormal thinking. I almost said beautifully. Whatever. I'll try not to read the entire chapter, but so much of this needs to be discussed. It opens like this. Now that I had my mission call, I had to deal with leaving behind my girlfriends. I say girlfriends because I'd had plenty of fun dating several wonderful girls the previous 3 years. Going steady with someone never really crossed my mind. The guys in high school who had steady girlfriends always acted stressed out or preoccupied. Now, when someone goes to this much effort to tell you how popular they are, or were, there's a good chance the exact opposite is, or was, true. Did he really have too many wonderful girls to choose from? Did going steady with someone really never cross his mind? Or was he just not able to get a girl to go out with him more than a couple of times? He continues. Meanwhile, my friends Don Fowers, Billy Fox, and I were happily playing the field. In fact, we spent most of our spare time arranging creative dates, which usually ended up either being hilarious or amazingly horrible. If I'd spent nearly as much time on my homework as I had on orchestrating those dates, I'd have been a straight-A student. I mean, there's nothing wrong with having fun on dates. There's nothing wrong with growing on creative dates. But I don't see anything in here about getting to know your date, which is the actual purpose of the date. And if all your dates turn out to be either hilarious or amazingly horrible, that suggests to me you're too immature to realize that getting to know the other person is the point of the date. Don, Billy, and I considered ourselves a 3-man fraternity, and when we matched the right activity with the right girls, things went great. A prank-filled candid camera in BYU's Wilkinson Center went spectacularly well, until 2 security guards escorted us to our car. Apparently Doug's idea of a great date is secretly filming strangers while making them uncomfortable. So what happens here is that Doug's friend Don asks out a girl named Connie, who's Miss Springville, and seems to be out of Don's league. I asked out May Christofferson, a cute blonde who had tolerated several of our previous adventures. We knew May would enjoy whatever date we came up with, but we were stumped on finding something to accommodate Connie, who was known for her immaculate clothing and always having every strand of her long brown hair in place. This description of May's willingness to do whatever reminds me of those men who say they want an easygoing woman, when what they really want is someone who won't ask anything of them emotionally. Ben Flapjack on The Bachelor was like that. And yes, I know his name wasn't Flapjack, but that's what I always called him. Don and Doug struggled to think up a date Connie would enjoy. This is Don speaking. It looks like we're stuck with just a regular dinner date, he said sadly. Shoot, maybe I'll call her up and cancel. I don't want to make a bad impression. How is taking someone to dinner a bad impression? Does Don think that the point of a date is to impress the other person with how unusual it is? Because I guarantee Connie would have preferred dinner over what these 3 do to her. Doug suggests they take Connie and May to a cave. Are you crazy? Don asked. Do you actually think Connie would go in a cave? He had a valid point, but I said, it'll be a surprise. We won't tell the girls where we're going. This conversation is bizarre to me. At my most charitable, I could maybe make an argument that they think Connie will have fun once she's in the cave, and they just need to encourage her to give spelunking a try. But it sounds more like they're deliberately planning a date they know Connie won't enjoy, and they're just working out the details of how to overcome her resistance. Which means they either enjoy making people uncomfortable, or this is a prelude to overcoming her resistance to other things. They pick Connie and May up and take them to Subway to get some sandwiches. Okay. Then they drive out toward this cave where they say they've already stashed some milk crates. I can't figure out why they'd need to drive out and stash milk crates in advance. At first I thought maybe they didn't want Connie to see them carrying milk crates and ask where they were going, But she asks anyway when Doug decides to drive through the foothills at breakneck speed, seemingly in order to help his friend Don get a little touch. "Where are we going?" Connie screamed from the back seat. "We're just climbing this hill," Doug replied nervously. He slapped me on the shoulder and said, "Slow down, Doug. You'll get us all killed." I watched in the rearview mirror as Don slipped his arm around Connie's shoulders, as if to protect her. I sensed Don was perfectly happy on this bumpy road. Ew, Chad. Just ew. This is also when we find out that May hates Connie. I glanced at May, and she gave me a small grin. She was enjoying seeing her classmate Connie completely out of her element. They get out of the car. Apparently the entrance to the cave is only 2 feet high, so Connie doesn't see it and thinks they're just going to sit outside and eat. It sounds like she's trying to make the best of things. "This isn't too bad," Connie said as she took a seat on the boulder. "It gives a nice view of the valley." But May is determined to see Connie uncomfortable. I was content to just eat our sandwiches outside, but May wasn't going to let us off the hook. She'd been on the receiving end of many of our pranks, and she was thrilled to see one of our stunts backfire. She sat down next to Connie and asked, "Should I go into the cave first, or would you like to?" I don't understand this use of the word prank. Surprising someone with the news that you've planned an activity you know they're going to hate as part of a social activity in which there's a lot of pressure to go along with the group isn't a prank. That's just being a jerk. And I think that on some level, Chad knows this, and that's why he puts the blame for the situation escalating on May instead of Doug. He doesn't want his fictional representation coming off as anything other than a gentleman. But how were Don and Doug imagining this would go? Did they think Connie would notice the entrance to the cave and throw a tantrum and that would be funny? Or that she'd take them by surprise by belly flopping into the dirt and happily squirming into the cave like a puppy in a puddle? So May mocks Connie for refusing to go into the cave and crawls in herself, and Doug follows her. I found May sitting on a crate. She shined a flashlight in my eyes. I slapped it away and lightly punched her shoulder. "You're cruel," I whispered. "Boy, that felt good," she said with a laugh. She's been looking down her pretty little nose at me since 6th grade. Connie apparently feels pressured to follow them, so she crawls on the ground in her new outfit into the cave, and they all sit down on the precious milk crates to eat their crappy sandwiches. Connie had regained her composure, and we started joking around as we unwrapped our sandwiches. "Boo!" Don shouted, making the cave echo for several seconds. Connie smiled at him. "You're such a prankster, Don," she said. May and I raised our eyebrows at each other. Were these two actually hitting it off? "Do you not want them to hit it off? This is a date! I don't understand what's happening here." And even after the car ride and the cave crawling and the frickin' Subway sandwiches, Connie is unreasonably gracious. Connie picked up her sandwich and took a big bite, and the rest of us joined her. "This is unsanitary, but I'll live," she said. "Thanks for inviting me." She sounds really nice. But just when it looks like things are going well, a mouse shows up and Connie becomes completely hysterical, kicking over milk crates, knocking everyone's delicious footlongs into the dirt, and the date ends. "I'm sorry, May," I said. "This has been a disaster. Just try to forget it." She laughed. "Doug, I'm never going to forget this date." I'm flummoxed by what I'm supposed to take away from this chapter. I don't get what Don and Doug's intentions for the date were, why they invited these girls, how they were hoping it would go, any of it. I find it bizarre that they decided to spend the last weeks before they became Christian missionaries hazing a local beauty queen. This story isn't in Chad's autobiography, but it's so strange that I'm inclined to think that some version of this actually happened. I do think it illustrates something very obvious from Chad's first book, which is that he doesn't understand people, and he doesn't understand how people interact or how they interact with social institutions like dates. He doesn't even understand the motivation of characters he based on himself, which suggests that he doesn't understand himself. And he definitely doesn't understand what makes for a good date. And thank heaven, that is the end of chapter 2. Chapter 3 continues the flashback. The day after Doug's unsuccessful, or perhaps successful, I'm not certain either way, date, his sister Emma comes to talk to him. Emma and I shared a special bond that had grown even deeper after she'd returned from her disappearance the previous summer. She'd vanished for 3 months, and during that time I was almost inconsolable. I hadn't realized how much Emma meant to me until she was gone. Life had seemingly lost its meaning. Now, this was shocking to me because it directly conflicts with the description of Doug and Emma's relationship from the previous book, in which Emma described Doug almost entirely in terms of how much she resented his athletic ability and status as a minor celebrity. Lots of siblings have different experiences growing up in the same household, but this seems extreme and inconsistent to me, especially given that at least a year has passed, and Emma hasn't even told Doug that she traveled through time. Like, how close are they if she didn't bother to mention that? So far, I've only told our parents and Tad about what really happened during my disappearance, Emma said. But we all feel I ought to share it with others and hopefully strengthen their testimonies about family history work. Since you're leaving soon, I'd like you to be the first to read what really happened. Doug reads the manuscript of An Errand for Emma. He doesn't say if he was offended by Emma's opinion that he'd never amount to much. He does demonstrate Chad's self-centeredness, though. I also noticed she failed to mention my mission call in her manuscript. She was too busy blathering about her upcoming wedding. You know the book is about her, right? It's her book about her. Then comes the funniest scene in this book. In case you've forgotten, the way time travel works in Chad Daybell novels is that if you hit your head hard enough, you go back in time. When Chad learns this from Emma's manuscript, he's immediately concerned. After all, he's an athlete. After reading the account of Emma's adventures among the saints in 1868, I truly hoped her mode of transportation wasn't genetic. She just smacked her head really hard and then woke up in a different time period. It bothered me enough that I cornered Dad one night to discuss it. Dad, is there any chance I could end up somewhere else in time like Emma did? They spend the next half page recalling times when Doug sustained head trauma without traveling through time, and finally conclude that he must just have a harder skull than Emma. It's so surreal. Thus ends chapter 3. Chapter 4 should start with a trigger warning for racism, classism, and bad math. We pick back up with Doug right after he's arrived in New Jersey for his mission. And to say that Doug is shocked by Newark is an understatement. I gawked like a child as we exited the freeway into Newark and dropped down into the biggest clog of humanity I'd ever witnessed. Did Chad just compare people to a wad of hair in a shower drain? What a horrible metaphor. And it just gets worse. Newark's sidewalks were overflowing with people, and each intersection was a crammed mess of bumper-to-bumper traffic and blaring horns. Fast-paced hip-hop music blasted from nearly every building and vehicle. I could actually feel the music rattle our car as the drivers in the souped-up Toyotas next to us cranked up their radios to earth-shaking levels. I noticed the back seats of their cars had been replaced with huge speaker systems. Boom, bada-da-da-da-da, boom. My heart seemed to pound in time with the music. I'd just spent 9 weeks in the Mission Training Center singing hymns, and this music sounded almost evil, yet it was strangely enticing. Amazingly, each radio was tuned to the same station, and the whole city seemingly moved to the rhythm. Hordes of teenagers stood in circles along the sidewalk, gyrating to the beat. We passed a street corner where someone had broken the cap off a fire hydrant, and dozens of young people frolicked in the water. The day's heat and humidity had intensified, and I longed to join them. I had to avert my eyes at times, though, as most of the teenage girls hadn't bothered to wear much clothing in the unseasonably hot weather. There's not much I can say about this passage other than it's awful. What Chad is implying is that black people are evil. Describing hip-hop as evil yet enticing is racist. And these 3 paragraphs are saturated with racist stereotypes. I understand that Chad grew up in Utah. I understand that only 0.75% of the population there in 1990 was black. I looked it up. But unfamiliarity isn't an excuse. His word choices here are deliberately made so that they have negative connotations. Words like hordes and gyrating. I feel a little strange saying this, but I think it's worth pointing out. If you remove the racist and classist attitude, the scene he's describing is actually quite charming. Imagine this. You're walking down a street full of people and cars, and it's fall, so everything is red and gold, but it's still warm outside. There's a nice breeze blowing, and every single car radio is playing the same song. And it's your favorite song. And everybody's singing it together. Everybody on the street has stopped rushing to get wherever they need to be. They've stopped for 5 minutes, and they're all just dancing. They're just letting loose. They're just having fun being alive and sharing this music and this moment of joy together. That's beautiful. That's a full-on frickin' Disney utopia. But what Chad sees when he looks at this scene isn't unity or community or the ecstasy of being alive. It's evil. It's evil because the music is too loud. It's evil because he doesn't like the way people are dressed. It's evil because no one looks like him. I don't know what version of this actually happened that Chad based this scene on, but I'm kind of sad because I feel like he either missed being part of something really special, or else he's seeing threats where there are none. And I'm not saying that Newark is a pristine wonderland. As I mentioned, I've been there. But there's nothing happening in this scene Chad describes that warrants characterizing it as evil. I mean, there are children frolicking in the water. That's not evil. I'm sorry. I will get off my soapbox now. I just thought that was worth pointing out. Doug is with 3 other missionaries in this scene. One, Elder Alvarado, has been a missionary in Newark for a while. Elder Alvarado is from Puerto Rico, and the other 3, including Doug, obviously, are white, which will come into play in the excerpt. "I don't know how you handle it down here," Elder Price said in admiration. "I'd freak out. It makes me eager to get back to the rich suburbs where the biggest danger is a door slamming in my face." "You'd get used to the streets," Elder Alvarado said. "I love it here. This downtown area is a wonderful cultural mix. 91% of the people are African American, 7% are from Spanish-speaking countries, and the other 2% of the people in our area are listed in the census as other. Of course, with you 3 here today, other might jump to 3%. Okay. The math surrounding these statistics isn't mathin'. Clearly 91, 7, and 2 add up to 100, but you can't divide people in this way. It says 91% of the people are black. Okay. That suggests we're being given the racial makeup of Newark. But 7% are from Spanish-speaking countries is describing people by country of origin. Does Chad not know that there are black people in Spanish-speaking countries? It's not even just comparing apples to oranges. It's like comparing apples to the imperial measurement system. And then this bit about other. If the current other population is 2%, but adding 3 more people would bring it up to 3%, that means that each percent represents approximately 3 people. And the entire population of Newark then is 300 people. In my video on Chad's first novel, I talked about Chad's worldview. He believes people are either good or evil. By and large, Mormons are good and everyone else is evil. That idea is very much in view in this story. People who accept the Mormon gospel are positively portrayed, and people who don't are negatively portrayed in ways ranging from being rude to actually attempting to murder Doug. Chad repeatedly refers to people on the street being unfriendly as persecution. Here's one example. At the end of the block, we edged our way through a group of people waiting at a bus stop. Several people commented on my height. I'm only 6'3", but I seemed to tower over them. One little black boy jumped in front of me and asked, "Hey, do you play for the Nets?" Several people in the crowd snickered, and somebody yelled, "Only when they're not working for the FBI," referring to our missionary suits. The whole group laughed at that. They seemed to be searching us for weaknesses, as if we were their prey. Chad is also 6'3". What a coincidence. He's extremely proud of his height. But my point here is that we're seeing Chad's paranoia. Somebody makes a very mild joke about him wearing a suit, and he claims he's being treated as prey. I was not a cool kid. And it took me until 9th grade to realize that sometimes when other kids teased me, it was because they were looking for a way to connect with me. They just wanted to talk to me. They wanted to hang out, whatever. It didn't mean I was their prey, although I never thought that. I just thought it meant they were mean. Chad actually describes being in Newark as living in an R-rated movie. On the next page, Doug and Elder Alvarado go knocking on doors. "Hello," I said. "We're missionaries from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day." She held up her hand. "Not interested." Then she slammed the door. It hurt my pride a little. How could she not care? I understand that missionaries feel like their work is important, but they need to be realistic about the likelihood that people will be irritated if strangers come and knock on their door. I was getting quite discouraged. I'd really expected to take New Jersey by storm, converting several families each month. My mission training center companion and I had calculated we'd be able to baptize at least 2,000 people in 2 years, depending on how many hours we worked on P-Day. I mean, the gospel is wonderful. All I had to do was share it for people to flock to the church, right? No, Chad, that is not how it works. You thought you'd be converting 3 people a day? The naivete of that blows my mind. Thus ends chapter 4. Doug and Elder Alvarado have dinner with an Ecuadorian family. We never learn why. I guess it's just a social call? I would skip over this scene, but it contains an interesting parallel to the cave date chapter. Basically, every time a new missionary comes to have dinner with them, the matriarch of this family cooks up a traditional Ecuadorian meal that she refuses to identify until after the missionaries have eaten it. I saw Bert take a big spoonful of soup. Then he said through clenched teeth, "It looks like I got one of the prizes." He opened his mouth and pulled out a chicken claw. Ugh! I felt like I was going to vomit. He laughed and said, "I wonder who got the other one." I quickly looked in my bowl, then leaped back in disgust. A chicken claw was lying in my spoon. They all erupted in laughter. "Welcome to Ecuador," Brother Rueda shouted. I'd been set up. Once the laughter died down and my stomach quit churning, Elder Alvarado said, "How did you like the cow tongue and vertebrae?" I felt my whole body break out in a sweat. Was that what I'd just put in my mouth? I shuddered and shook my head again and again. Finally I said, "Oh, this is disgusting." Sister Rueda looked hurt by my reaction, so I tried to smooth it over. "I'm sorry, I'm just not used to this kind of food." This is exactly the sort of prank I could see Doug playing on someone else. But when it's played on him, he doesn't think it's funny at all. He demonstrates no insight into this double standard, and he's very rude. So he and Elder Alvarado spend Thanksgiving with a Peruvian family. I saw a bottle of Peru's favorite carbonated drink. Inca Cola on the table, and I involuntarily licked my lips. The beverage was yellow and looked disgustingly unhealthy, but it made an ice-cold Sprite taste like bathwater. The ward members claimed there wasn't any caffeine in the drink, but it always gave me a buzz. I was curious about this stuff, so I looked it up. It's made by Coke, and despite being yellow, it apparently tastes like bubble yum. I would love to hear from anyone who's tried this. I'm very curious about it. I'm allergic to corn syrup and can't have soda. Oh, and it's definitely caffeinated. In case you aren't aware, Mormons aren't allowed to drink caffeine. Doug and Elder Alvarado seem to spend all their time going door to door handing out Books of Mormon. I guess that's their main job as missionaries. I don't really know. Most of the stories in this section are retellings of things that actually happened to Chad. Although since he wrote his autobiography 15 years after he wrote this novel, I think it maybe makes more sense to call them pre-tellings. I know, I'm cute like that. They visit a couple and discuss a dream the man had that everyone agrees indicates he's meant to join the church. Thus ends chapter 5. As Doug and Elder Alvarado walk back to their crappy basement apartment one evening, Doug feels something. As we walked along, I began to feel a presence walking along beside me. I glanced out of the corner of my eye, and although I couldn't see anything, I knew there was actually a spirit personage at my side. I wasn't scared. It felt almost natural. Then came the impression, "You're doing great. I'm proud of you. I'll be nearby to help when times get tough." This was a dear friend at my side, although I'd never met him in this life. As sure as I was breathing, I knew I was somehow communicating with my great-grandpa Keith Dalton, who'd been killed in a logging accident 5 decades earlier. Here are a couple photos of Keith Daybell, Chad's real grandfather, who really was killed in a logging accident. He looks like a nice guy. My complaint here is with the writing. How does Doug know this presence is his great-grandfather, especially given that they've never met? It isn't like he could have recognized, I don't know, great-grandpa Keith's scent or the way he walks. I don't know exactly what this presence is putting out there, but the whole thing comes out of nowhere. Chad would have been wise to have foreshadowed this in some way. I don't think he knows the word foreshadow. At the very least, though, he could have explained what Doug sensed that allowed him to identify his great-grandpa. I mean, he's got Grandpa Keith talking here, telepathically, I guess. Why couldn't he have identified himself then? Doug writes a letter about this experience to his great-grandmother, Rosalie, who's still alive, and she writes back and says, "I'm glad he's with you and watching over you, and oh, by the way, my doctor found something funny on a scan of my abdomen, but I'm sure it's nothing serious. Here's some toffee." It's immediately obvious that great-grandma Rosalie is doomed. Then Doug learns he's been reassigned to Jersey City. Thus ends chapter 6. Doug starts work in Jersey City with his new missionary companion, Elder Fawson. Doug is irritated when he learns that some people have never heard of God, which he instantly connects to his own racism. "How can a person not know about God?" I asked as we walked home. "That seems impossible. And how did all these Cuban families end up here anyway?" Then he goes on a rant about the evils of voodoo. One terrifying thing many of these people brought from their homelands was their dark superstitions and beliefs. We encountered many variations, but we just called it voodoo. There is little doubt voodoo is one of Satan's favorite tactics. While only a few openly practiced such beliefs, casual exposure to it over the years had tainted many people. It had affected their way of thinking and left little room for acceptance of the true gospel. We could truly feel the oppression being directed at us by the evil one. Satan had ruled New Jersey's inner cities for decades, and he wasn't the least bit happy about us invading his territory. A true battle had begun. Apparently you don't even have to practice voodoo. Just living near a voodoo practitioner can turn you evil. And you don't even have to practice voodoo. You just have to practice a religion Chad doesn't recognize. Once again, we see Chad's bigotry, his naivete, and his paranoia here. Voodoo is a religion like any other. And before anyone loses their minds in the comments saying, but they sacrifice the occasional animal, go read the book of Leviticus. If there's one thing that's clear in the Bible, it's that nothing makes God happier than the smell of animals on fire. A pleasing odor is in there like 600 times. This segues into the most deranged of Doug's missionary encounters. He and Elder Fawson have now developed some sort of psychic ability to sense an apartment complex spiritual energy. And one day they go into a building that feels really evil. They knock on a door and a woman answers, and I think her response to their proselytizing is the funniest one. "You represent Jesus Christ? That's ridiculous," she said defiantly. "He's dead. Give it up." The idea of pointing out that Jesus died when you're speaking to missionaries is just amusing to me. It's such a smart mouth answer. They start to leave, but they end up meeting the woman's husband in the lobby. He takes them into the apartment because he wants to talk to them, but then he just forces Doug to touch his head in a spot where he's missing part of his skull and brain. He says that Fidel Castro did this to him. And while he's talking about the evil of communism, his wife returns and gives Doug and Elder Fawson some glasses of Sprite. Then there's this very cinematic moment. "I took a sip. Then I noticed a row of dolls on a shelf in the hall. I pointed them out to Elder Fawson and fearfully whispered, 'Are those voodoo dolls?' Then I glanced into the glass I was holding. There was a white powder swirling around in the bottom of the glass." Doug and Elder Fawson run screaming out of the apartment, race home, throw themselves to their knees, and begin praying. We soon felt surrounded by feelings of love, and we knew without a doubt how important it is to be on the Lord's team. The brief feelings I'd endured while in the adversary's locker room were frightening, and it felt so comforting to know I had the Savior on my side. This passage is such a lesson in poorly chosen analogies. I assume Chad wants his readers to be scared, but all I can think about is Satan's locker room. Did they have to smell Satan's dirty sweat socks? Was his jockstrap lying out? Was it red? I can't take this moment seriously at all. Then there's a scene where the missionaries play baseball with some teenage church members. There's a local teen who's being scouted as a pitcher, but of course Doug manages to hit his 100-mile-an-hour fastball and earn his respect. It's just another ego-stroking scene. After that, Doug gets transferred again and assigned another new companion. Doug meets his new companion, Elder Martin. There's yet another reference to the Twin Towers that has nothing to do with the rest of the book. Doug and Elder Martin get to work knocking on doors, and they meet a woman named Anna with 3 children who really wants to hear about the Book of Mormon. This is another story that Chad claims really occurred. The woman and her children are receptive to the gospel, but her husband isn't. Anna has been praying for God to show her the true church, and she had a dream that 2 American men would appear on her doorway wearing white shirts and ties, so she immediately believes that Doug and Elder Martin are emissaries of Jesus. Thus ends chapter 8. Anna's husband isn't thrilled that his family is getting into the LDS church. Chad implies that he's an alcoholic who watches too much soccer and refuses to supervise his hyper 7-year-old son, Fernando. This is one of the more disturbing scenes in this story. And it's especially disturbing given that one of Chad's victims, JJ Vallow, was also 7 years old. Chad even claimed that JJ scratched him, in a strange parallel with this scene. This description takes place as Doug and Elder Martin are trying to have a religious discussion with Anna. Anna had many questions, and I did my best to answer them. Meanwhile, Fernando was at his worst. He would leap on Elder Martin and try to slug him and scratch his face. So, what do these representatives of Jesus Christ do? What anyone would do. They beat the kid unconscious. Elder Martin tolerated the abuse for a few minutes, But then he finally did what anyone would do in the face of such an attack. He fought back. I watched out of the corner of my eye as Elder Martin defended himself with a well-placed fist on top of Fernando's head. It slowed the little animal for a moment, but then he kept coming. Elder Martin then calmly pounded on Fernando's head a bit harder. Fernando backed off for a second before Elder Martin gave him 3 more sharp whacks on top of the head. Fernando was out cold, although the kid somehow stayed on his feet. Yeah, Elder Martin hits the kid in the head. Twice. And even after Fernando backs off, Elder Martin hits him 3 more times. It's lucky he didn't send the kid to the past. But the worst part is Doug's response. He apologizes to Elder Martin for Fernando being so distracting. Finally, I said, "I'm so sorry. Next time I'll handle Fernando." Elder Martin stared straight ahead. "I know we're expected to suffer in the name of the Lord, but that kid is almost too much." He put his hands out in front of him, pretending to choke something. "I came this close to strangling the little rascal," he said. "I know Max is egging him on when we're not there, but I was so mad at that kid. I'm here to teach, not babysit." "You did great," I said. "You certainly earned a technical knockout. He was seeing stars." This is horrifying. Chad is a father of 5, and the fact he thinks this is an appropriate way to deal with a hyper 7-year-old is so disturbing in light of what happened to JJ. I mean, no wonder Deseret books won't carry Chad's writing. And this line about Max here refers to Doug's paranoia that Max is egging Fernando on when they aren't around, that he's manipulating the kid to interrupt these religious discussions. Like, nobody needs to pressure a 7-year-old to be hyper. That's how God made them. And it's concerning to me that Chad doesn't realize that. Anyway, the other scene in this chapter involves Elder Martin blessing Anna's daughter's arm, which is atrophied due to a medical condition. Anna is instantly healed. Literally instantly. And Chad also claims that that really happened. Thus ends chapter 9. Doug and Elder Martin are harassed by yet another unhinged rando on a street corner. They get on a bus and they're riding across a bridge when Doug sees a teenage girl climbing over the bridge railing. It's not a bridge across water, it's just a bridge across other lanes of traffic, apparently. The bus driver refuses to stop, so Doug just throws open the door and jumps out. Somehow he manages to climb over the railing and approach without the girl noticing him. But as soon as she sees him, she jumps back over the railing onto the bridge, bites Elder Martin, and then runs away. Doug and Elder Martin have a whole conversation about her while Doug's still standing on the wrong side of the railing. He decides to take his backpack off before climbing over the railing onto the bridge proper, and in the process he loses his balance and falls. Chad has this really stupid habit of making people speak whole sentences during very brief instants, and he does it twice here. I took the pack off my shoulder, but just before I handed it to Elder Martin, I lost my footing on the slick metal bridge. I grabbed the railing with my one available hand, leaving me dangling above the freeway. "Oh boy, this isn't good," I muttered. I hung there for an instant, but my fingers quickly slipped away from the railing. Elder Martin lunged for me, but it was too late. I was falling into the path of an approaching 18-wheeler. "Dear Lord, I'll do anything if you get me out of this," I prayed as I fell. I tried to get my legs under me, hoping to at least bounce out of the path of the truck, but the weight of my backpack twisted me around. The first thing to hit the pavement was my face. Thus ends chapter 10. Chad really does think people can bounce. It's pretty funny. He has multiple characters who bounce when they fall on things. We're now on page 51 of a 176-page novel, and Doug has finally sustained sufficiently severe head trauma to send him back in time. I joked about how unrealistic it was that Emma figured out she'd been sent back in time in only 3 paragraphs in her novel. Even with advance warning that it could happen to him, it takes Doug 4 paragraphs. Then reality hit me like a bullet in the chest. I'd been yanked back in time, just like Emma had been. His response, though, was a little misdirected. I was stunned and angry, because I'd been sure I was incapable of time travel. I'd taken so many hard hits while playing sports that I'd felt immune to the Dalton curse. So, you're mad that you were wrong, but you aren't mad that you inadvertently traveled through time? That isn't upsetting to you? Oh, and it isn't a family curse if it only happened to one family member. So, Doug has woken up and passed in a woman's backyard, and he runs into her house, where she and her toy poodle confront him with a rolling pin. I want to clarify before I read this that little Fluffy magically turns out to be uninjured, so don't stress. I leaped to my feet and gave the woman a left forearm to the throat, knocking her off balance. She took a vicious swing at my head with the rolling pin, but she only grazed my shoulder before toppling onto her back. "Kill him, Fluffy! Bite! Bite!" the woman shrieked. The poodle was instantly nipping at my heels, but a swift golf swing with my backpack sent Fluffy sailing 20 feet into an ash-filled fireplace at the far end of the room. Like I said, we learn later in this scene that Fluffy is okay, but if this happened in real life, the scene would end quite differently. Doug hides in some shrubbery, where he reflects on how in the right he was. If only the woman had been more understanding, I said to myself. I realized I'd startled her, and I'd been very rude, but she'd clearly overreacted. I felt terrible about hitting a woman in the throat, but then I pictured the woman holding the rolling pin above her head. She'd gotten what she deserved. I couldn't help smiling as I pictured a soot-covered Fluffy leaping all over the house. I took a moment to evaluate my circumstances, and I felt the Lord's hand in this strange situation. Really? You committed breaking and entering and attempted murder against both a woman and her dog, and you see the Lord's hand in that? I really am blown away by how obvious Chad's violent antisocial tendencies are in his writing. Like, what do you want to bet it was his idea to get rid of JJ's service dog? I mean, if this scene is any indication, we're probably lucky that they only rehomed it. Doug hides in the back of a truck that drives him into Manhattan, where he finds a phone book and tries to call the local LDS church. But it's evening and no one answers. He discovers that it's September of 1944. After running into several rude locals, he crawls under a bush in Central Park and goes to sleep. Remember that scene in An Errand for Emma where a guy who's obviously some sort of divine being shows up and leads Emma and George and David to a cave where they can spend the night? The same guy shows up in this book. He wakes Doug up in the morning in the park, and Doug thanks him, like he might have overslept otherwise. Then the stranger recommends that Doug visit the Empire State Building, and Doug just says, "Yeah, that's a good idea." What about your time travel mission from God? Does God want you to go sightseeing? I guess so, because Doug again thanks this stranger for waking him up, and then heads off to the Empire State Building. I waved goodbye and started down a pathway toward the city, but the man's mannerisms had stoked my curiosity. He'd seemed like a long-lost brother. I went back and looked for mannerisms. There aren't any. And Chad leaves us hanging as to in what way this man feels like a long-lost brother. But what blows my mind the most about this scene is that in the last scene, when Doug called the local LDS church but no one answered, there seemed to be an implication that he would try again in the morning. So why is he abandoning this plan, which at least makes some sense? At least he could probably get some food and a blessing there. But instead, he goes to the Empire State Building, only to end up at the same LDS church later that day. Why did we need this whole sightseeing trip, where he just happens to bump into some Mormons who help him out? It's an unnecessary detour in a book that is already dragging. So he goes to the Empire State Building and takes the elevator to the top. He has to spend his only nickel, right, to go up to the top. That was the nickel he was going to use to call the church, so I guess we've just given up on that plan entirely. On the top floor, a little girl points to him and says, "Look, a missionary." Her father does the same thing all Chad Daybell characters do. He blurts out all sorts of personal information with basically no prompting. "I'm Elder Dalton," I said. "Is there any chance you're LDS?" The man nodded enthusiastically. "I sure am," he said. "I'm Andy, and this is my daughter Brooke. We're from Connecticut, and we're on our way to see Elder Benson." "Which Elder Benson?" I asked. "Ezra Taft Benson, the newest member of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles," Andy said. "He's visiting the missions and wards along the East Coast, and today he's visiting the Brooklyn ward. What luck! If I could meet with Elder Benson, maybe he could answer some of my questions, if he'd believe my story." Meanwhile, Andy continued, "My wife is 7 months pregnant, so she encouraged me to take the day off and take Brooke off her hands so she could rest. Brooke has never met an apostle, so we thought it would be worth the trip if we combined a little sightseeing." Thank you, Andy, for letting me in on your thought process regarding your decision to visit the Empire State Building today. Andy gives Doug a ride to the Brooklyn LDS Church, and Doug manages to convince Elder Benson to speak with him privately. Thus ends Chapter 12. Now it's Doug's turn to info-dump his own life story on Elder Benson. They spend a couple of pages admiring Doug's triple combination, which contains sections that aren't in Elder Benson's version, and that's all it takes for Elder Benson to start believing in time travel. He doesn't know what Doug's time travel mission is either, so they decide to pray about it. Now, to be clear, I'm not mocking prayer here. I'm not a Christian, but I am a person of faith, and I believe in prayer. I pray all the time, and I think it's appropriate for religious characters to pray in fiction. But prayer, as it is depicted in this story, is far-fetched, if not downright silly. These two men pray, then kneel silently for 30 seconds, and Chad clarifies that it's exactly 30 seconds. And that's all it takes for Elder Benson to get a very specific answer. He put his arm around me, then said, "The church's missionary program has been severely reduced until the conclusion of the war. Our young men are serving their country, and that is where they should be right now. Elder Dalton, the Lord desires that you also join the armed forces." Okay. Odd, but okay. Maybe God felt that 12 million Americans wouldn't be enough and decided to employ the awesome power of time travel to send just one more guy. Maybe one more guy will make the difference. Doug, of course, is stunned and doesn't especially want to go to war, so he asks why God's sending him to do this. I don't know the reasons why, but the words shipyard are coming to my mind, Elder Benson said. He stood quietly for a moment, then nodded firmly. Yes, it is clear now. You must be at the Brooklyn Navy Yard's main gate at 3 p.m. today. What? This is your message from God? Meet me at the shipyard main gate at 3? This doesn't sound like divine inspiration. It sounds more like the automated text message I get from my dentist reminding me to schedule a cleaning. Like, where's the awe? Where's the wonder? Where's the mystery? When you write an overtly religious novel, the goal is usually to inspire or at least enhance someone's faith. But the version of God that appears in Chad's novels doesn't do that. I had more faith in Dumbledore. It really kind of blows my mind, because I assume that the fact that over and over he references experiences of reverence, but is never able to describe them, means he's never actually felt reverence. He's never felt awe or wonder. He's probably never felt connected to God, ironically. That's why he always says the spirit was strong in the room, instead of telling us what it's like to feel the spirit. And no, obviously he could never do that experience justice, not on paper at least, But anybody who's felt a genuine connection with something bigger than themselves would be able to do better than this. And I'm talking like middle schoolers here. Like, yeah, when I was in middle school in 7th grade, I was leading a bunch of students from my Catholic school in an underground Wiccan coven. And we spoke more authentically about our spiritual lives than this guy. And yet somehow he's the one with the cult following. Anyway, Elder Benson tells Doug that he better get going if he's going to make it to the shipyard in only 45 minutes. Thus ends chapter 13. Lest you think I won't give credit where credit is due, though, I will give Chad 2 points of credit here. The section of the book that takes place in the past is noticeably better written than anything else of his I've read. The pacing is better, there are scene descriptions, which Chad often just skips, and there's an actual sense of tension in at least part of it. I'm not convinced Chad made any of this up from his imagination. In fact, this book references a biographical document that Chad's father wrote about Chad's grandfather's experiences during World War II, and I think it's likely that Chad ripped off nearly all of this from that document. But even so, he does a reasonably okay job fictionalizing it. I will also give him credit that the way he gets Doug into the army is clever, although it's also a little reminiscent of The Parent Trap. First, though, Chad has to explain why he's going to write 60 pages of World War II fan fiction without a single swear. Before I go on, I'd just like to clarify that from this moment on in 1944, I heard profanity used in nearly every sentence. For example, the above command from the soldier in the Jeep actually contained 6 more words, but rather than subject you to such vulgarity, I'll just give you the dialogue minus the colorful language. Although it was educational to hear people use the same profane words as adjectives, adverbs, and nouns, often all in the same sentence, this story is much more enjoyable without the profanity. Believe me. I don't believe you at all. So Doug reaches the Navy Yard's main gate and just sort of loiters around because he doesn't know what to do. Then a soldier pulls up in a Jeep and starts screaming at him. He knows Doug's last name is Dalton, and he orders him to change into a uniform and get to the dock because they're shipping out in 5 minutes. So Doug grabs his triple combination, which is the Book of Mormon, the Doctrine and Covenants, and Pearl of Great Price, and stuffs them into a duffel bag. Because when you're planning to walk across Europe in the mud, occasionally sprinting to avoid gunfire, you want to pack books. Doug runs into a bunch of other soldiers, one named Tex, who seems to know him and refers to him as the Utah Kid. Doug's pretty confused until he reaches roll call. He hears Dalton called and answers, but so does someone else, because it turns out that Great-Grandpa Keith is also on his way to war. Now, this worked for me. Yeah, it's far-fetched, but I don't mind suspending disbelief to a reasonable extent, and it was certainly more fun than having Doug just sneak onto the ship. Also, it accomplishes a plotting goal that I'm always keeping in the back of my mind. Whenever something goes right for your protagonist in a story, it has to make things worse. What I mean is, even when a character manages to pull something off, the stakes of their ultimate goal have to increase. Their overall situation becomes more dire. I think the classic example of this is Beowulf. Beowulf kills the monster, Grendel. He and his boys are all getting plastered and singing celebration songs, and then Grendel's mother shows up. By killing one monster, he's awakened a far worse monster. In Chad's book, Doug has solved the little problem of how to join the army, like the Lord wants. But it turns out he has a much bigger problem, which is protecting his great-grandfather during World War II. Because obviously if Grandpa Keith dies, that's not going to improve things for Doug. It's not a brilliant plotting move, but it's better than the text message from God, so I'm tossing a couple of points to Chad. Thus ends chapter 14. The army assumes there's been a mix-up, because Doug and Grandpa Keith are both named Dalton, and they just sort of hand-wave him being there. Under normal conditions, I would have been questioned more closely, but at this point in the war, so many men were being shipped overseas that there wasn't time for anyone to follow up on minor discrepancies. I mean, maybe? I really don't know, but it seems unlikely to me, given that they're at war. So Tex is angry that he thought Doug was Grandpa Keith earlier, and Doug didn't say anything. Now he doesn't trust Doug because he thinks Doug's a stowaway. Because apparently no one in the American military knows that Germany had spies. So Tex is going to stick to Doug like glue. He gets Doug transferred to his unit and bunk room, which he also just happens to share with Grandpa Keith. Doug spends a while wondering if God sent him through time to protect Grandpa Keith during the war. That's apparently what the book wants us to believe. But there are two major problems here. The first is that, with a single exception, Doug never does anything to protect Grandpa Keith. The second, though, is that there's a time travel paradox here. If God has taken the extraordinary step of sending Doug back in time to watch over Grandpa Keith, then presumably Grandpa Keith didn't survive the war. But if Grandpa Keith didn't survive the war, how is Doug alive to get sent back in time? It's a problem, one of which I'm sure Chad is unaware. Doug and Grandpa Keith become friends. My family's originally from Wasatch County, near Heber, I said. Have you ever heard of Finity Dalton? I'm descended from him. What a coincidence, Keith said. Finity Dalton's my great-grandpa. He slapped me on the back. It'll be nice to have a relative around. He knows Grandpa Keith is from Springville, Utah, so he says he's from Heber? I'm not sure why, but this makes Tex less suspicious instead of more. I mean, a guy shows up on an army transport vessel headed to the front lines. His name isn't on the roster. He wasn't in boot camp with you. And now he's claiming to be the cousin of someone on board, a cousin he's never met, even though they live less than an hour apart. But for some reason, Tex isn't concerned, and he does Doug the honor of bestowing a nickname on him. Wasatch, because Heber is in Wasatch County. Only Tex came into this scene late, after Doug mentioned Wasatch County. Thus ends chapter 15. They sail to England. Chad claims that he based Doug on one of his sons, but there's so much of his own life story in here. He has a brief scene where Doug recalls being hit by a rogue wave at La Jolla Cove in San Diego. Well, Chad claims that that was his second near-death experience. He even included a photo of the scratches he got. Although it's worth noting that Doug doesn't claim it was a near-death experience, which tracks with the reports that Chad never referred to it as a near-death experience until he saw how well Julie Rowe's near-death experience memoir was selling. But this inclusion also speaks to the fact that all of Chad's characters are based on Chad. He can't imagine being anyone else. He doesn't have the creativity or the empathy. That's why all of his characters are the same person. Like Doug, Tex, Grandpa Keith, they're all exactly alike. They all talk and act the same way. They make the same weak jokes. The only people who act differently are the evil ones, and they all act like each other. Doug and Grandpa Keith get to know each other a little, as in they have their second conversation. We'll just have to watch out for each other. Keith, you feel like a long-lost brother. You can count on me. He clasped my arm. Thanks, Doug. I'll be there for you, too. I hate this. I'm going to pause while I climb back on my soapbox. My personal definition of melodrama is when characters say or do things that express an emotion that the events of the story don't justify them feeling. These two men barely know each other. They've told each other what cities they live in and briefly discussed how much they enjoy being Mormon. That is not enough to have engendered the bonds of brotherhood, and it's cringe. From this point until Doug returns to the future, Chad is going to slip in all these little comments about how Doug's in better shape than anyone else is. It's hilarious. He does it exactly the same way he kept mentioning how pretty Emma was in the last book, and he probably does it for the same reason. Despite missing boot camp, I was in better shape than most of the men. The troops land in Southampton, England, cross into France, march through France and the Netherlands, which Chad incorrectly refers to as Holland, even though Witten is in Drenthe, and to the German border. Before they head for the front lines, one of the men calls for Grandpa Keith to lead them in prayer. I saw Keith being prodded to the front of the group. He soon stood before us and offered one of the most heartfelt prayers I've ever heard as he pleaded with the Lord to help us in our fight for liberty and truth. After the prayer, most of the men wiped away tears, including me. This could have been a great opportunity to characterize Keith. The fact that the men feel he's the one who should offer the prayer says a lot about him and about his relationship with the rest of his unit. But this is one of those times when Chad doesn't know how to balance showing and telling. He did great for most of this chapter. We didn't need to live through weeks of marching. Telling us that they marched instead of narrating every day was the right call. But when someone does something so deeply connected to who they are, and when it affects everyone around them the way this prayer apparently does, the author needs to include the prayer. He can't just say it was really touching. That's insufficient. A couple paragraphs later, we get another little detail about what great shape Doug is in. The rifle, ammunition, and pack we carried had a combined weight of about 70 pounds, and we were all exhausted and sore. Thankfully, my feet had been toughened from walking New Jersey's streets for nearly a year, so I developed only minor blisters. You're so vain, Chad. Thus ends chapter 16. They marched to Hurtgen Forest, which is known as the Meat Grinder. This was a real battle, and according to Chad, Grandpa Keith did fight in it. Doug's unit, which is called the Rail Splitters, for reasons unknown, arrives at the battle and immediately starts acting like idiots. I'm quite skeptical if this part of the story is true. One German tank made a charge, but it came under heavy fire. Then we saw our troops launch what looked like a ball of flame, which landed under the tank. Within a few seconds, the center of the tank exploded into several pieces. "Nice shot," someone called out, and we all gave a ragged cheer. Cheering wasn't wise, though. The noise we'd made caught the attention of a German sniper who'd slipped behind the front lines. A shot rang out, and mud splattered at my feet. "Take cover!" Sergeant Olson shouted, and we dove behind trees and rocks. This isn't a football game. This is war. The cheering attracts the attention of the sniper, who begins picking people off. Grandpa Keith manages to neutralize the threat. Thus ends chapter 17. They dig foxholes and basically sit in them and wait. I couldn't get the face of that dead 16-year-old German sniper out of my mind. Certainly, there were righteous people on the German side. I remembered a discussion in seminary in which our teacher pointed out that some members of the church had fought for Germany in World War II, out of patriotic duty. I prayed that church members on both sides would be spared. Here's another example of Chad's black and white thinking. I have to be careful with my vocabulary here because of YouTube's community guidelines, so I'll borrow a term from Film Cooper. Yahtzees. Chad is fine with people being Yahtzees as long as they're LDS. He's praying for the Yahtzees here. Apparently no action can be evil, condemnable, reprehensible if it's performed by a Mormon. And this prayer stands in complete contradiction to Grandpa Keith's prayer 2 chapters ago. Do you want to win this war or not? It sounds like Doug wants to win, but not at the expense of Mormon Yahtzees. My point is, Chad didn't think this through. He's never thinking things through. They all write letters home, and Doug doesn't have anyone to write to, so he writes to Grandpa Keith's wife, Doug's great-grandmother Rosalie, the one who's dying of stomach cancer in modern times. I only mention this because it'll come up later. He really should have written her a letter that said, "You're going to die of stomach cancer. Maybe keep an eye on that." No, that's insane. Forget I said that. Doug's division commander decides they're going to attack the German line. From what our spies can determine, the Germans are bunched together on what used to be a farm, Sergeant Huff said. The farm's surrounded by a 4-foot-high brick wall, and the German forces are assembled inside the wall. We hope to capture the farm, and at the very least gain a foothold across the meadow. Before we get to the attack, however, I want to point out an issue that we've seen before and will see again, and it's one I come across in developing writing all the time. At 9 p.m., it was dark enough to crawl across the meadow undetected. Tex, Keith, and I stuck together. The three of us had formed quite a bond, and staying together seemed to bring us good luck. When did they form a bond? What were they doing? What made them feel close to each other? And when did being together ever bring them good luck? They've been ordered to a battle that's being referred to as the meat grinder. That's not good luck. To me, this is a form of melodrama. These characters have a relationship that nothing in the text has established. If you want them to bond, give them something to bond over and write a scene about it. Don't just say, they have a bond. This is a huge issue I see in romances, and not just in romance novels, but even in romance subplots. People don't just fall in love for no reason. They aren't attracted to each other for no reason. And the reader can't fall in love with them, by which I mean alongside, if they don't get to witness that relationship developing. So here, I don't care about the relationship between Tex, Keith, and Doug because I haven't really seen them interact. So they crawl across the meadow and reach this 4-foot-high wall that surrounds the farmhouse where the German soldiers are. This is the first real action scene in one of Chad's books, and it's very confusing. I don't know why none of Chad's action sequences make sense, but they're universally terrible. We soon saw our fellow rail splitters crawling over the wall, but at least half of them never made it. Just as they'd try to scamper over, the Germans would shoot them down. Enough soldiers finally made it over the wall to disrupt the Germans, and we could hear fierce fighting taking place on the other side. It sounds like the Germans are in the farmhouse, maybe shooting out the windows. So what does it mean that enough soldiers finally made it over the wall? Enough to do what? We reached the wall and waited for a lull in the shooting. Tex dived over first. "It looks clear," he called back to us. "I'll cover for you. Catch up when you can." If Tex is the one running through enemy fire, then shouldn't Doug and Grandpa Keith be covering him? Isn't that how covering someone works? Grandpa Keith tries to go over the wall and something happens to his knee, but it isn't clear what. Maybe Chad didn't have the details and that's why he fudged this? Once he was lying flat, I slid next to him on my stomach. I ripped open his pant leg and inspected his knee. "There's no blood," I said. "Something hit me," he said in agony. "Maybe a fragment of the wall got me. My knee feels busted." I'm sure that war is chaotic and that people do receive injuries without knowing exactly how they occurred, but it's distracting here. I felt his knee again more closely. As I ran my hand over his kneecap, I could feel the damage. "Your kneecap is cracked in at least 3 places," I said grimly. "It's starting to swell up." There's no way Doug is able to discern the details of this injury by feeling it with his fingers, and if he tried, it would hurt. This is outlandish. The battle continues, but Doug stays on the outside of the wall with Grandpa Keith. He decides he needs to get Grandpa Keith back across the meadow, so he finds some sticks and uses his jacket to build like a little travois-looking thing, was what I'm imagining. Then he puts Grandpa Keith on it and drags him back across the meadow, but there's no indication the battle has stopped. Doug must be walking upright to be pulling Grandpa Keith on his travois, but magically, no one sees them. Thus ends chapter 18. So it's bad enough that no one sees them, but Chad opens chapter 19 by pointing out how improbable that was. "We somehow made it back across the meadow without being spotted. The Germans were apparently content to just hold their side of the meadow, although they could have easily finished us off." If you're going to include a plot element that you know is weak, don't point out its weakness to your readers. Doug gives Grandpa Keith a priesthood blessing to help heal his knee. I have taken all of my Reiki levels, and I started doing energy work when I was 13, so I'm not one to mock the laying on of hands. But from here on, Grandpa Keith acts like he never injured his knee at all. They mention it a couple of times, but it doesn't actually affect Grandpa Keith's ability to get around. It's like it never happened. They sit in their foxhole all night reading scripture by candlelight, even though I would think that you wouldn't want to light a candle at night when you're still engaged in a firefight. But maybe I don't understand how these things work. And then Tex shows up and it turns out he's still alive and they're all happy. Thus ends chapter 19. The next morning, German tanks move in on their position and begin destroying their fortifications. But for some reason, they don't fire any shells. Again, that seems awfully convenient. I don't know enough about military strategy to know if that makes sense or not. Grandpa Keith tells Doug and Tex that they have to get out of their foxhole and hide in a deep bomb crater. That somehow this will protect them from the German tanks. I don't know if that makes sense either. I guess not, because Doug, Tex, and Grandpa Keith all end up getting taken prisoner. Thus ends chapter 20. They're taken to a German POW camp, where they receive care packages from the Red Cross. Because Doug and Grandpa Keith don't smoke, they begin trading the Red Cross cigarettes. Yes, children, the Red Cross used to hand out cigarettes to German ladies in exchange for bread. There's a very perplexing problem, though. Tex seemed to be holding up well, but Keith's boots had been damaged in our encounter with the tank, and his feet were beginning to freeze. Both of his boots were damaged by the tank, but his feet weren't injured? How is that possible? Did he take his boots off, let the tank run over them, and then put them back on? It's complete nonsense, and it's clear Chad only included it to set up a later scene. One morning, the guards search everyone and discover that Doug has been hoarding the sugar packets the Red Cross sends him. Yes, the Red Cross used to hand out sugar too. And condoms. The Red Cross is very pragmatic. Anyway, I'd stuffed a few extra sugar packets into my boots, but the guard found them. He stood up and struck me across the face with the packets. One packet burst open and coated my face. Not bad, I said, licking my lips. Tex then dragged his finger across my cheek. Thanks for dessert, he said with a grin. Another example of Chad's terrible sense of humor. Maybe it's also an attempt to show how Doug lacks the common sense to be afraid of his captors. The Germans start marching them somewhere, and they have to march through the snow. When one prisoner collapses, the guards refuse to let the others carry him, and instead shouts, "No touch!" That's when I noticed the streaks of blood in the snow. I watched Keith's feet, and each time he swung his right foot forward, a streak of blood would appear. "Keith, you're bleeding," I hissed. He stopped for a moment and noticed the red stain. He bent down and looked at his foot. "My boot sole is ripped up," he said. "The snow's chewing my foot apart." Again, I don't understand how a tank ripped up the sole of his boot. I don't really understand how snow can chew up his foot either. Frostbite doesn't cause bleeding. The blood freezes. So Grandpa Keith's feet freeze, and he starts crawling on the ground. Doug and Tex aren't allowed to touch him, but they find a wooden plank that just happens to be lying on the side of the road, and they carry Grandpa Keith on it. But our actions infuriated the guard. "Drop him," the guard shouted, but we ignored him. The guard then tried to break our grip on the plank by banging on the board with his rifle, but Tex quickly grabbed the gun and flung it into the snow. I don't know why the guard didn't immediately retrieve the gun and kill us all. Instead, he stood speechless. "We won't leave our friend. Doesn't human life mean anything to you?" Tex asked the guard. "Look, we aren't touching him. Isn't that the rule?" The guard ends up agreeing that the rule is they aren't allowed to touch him, and they aren't technically touching him. Does Chad seriously think this would work? Well, they're following the rules. I guess my hands are tied. This is also a second incident in which Chad has someone do something that doesn't make any sense and then points it out to the reader. I don't know why the guard didn't immediately retrieve the gun and kill us all. Well, now that you mention it, me neither. Thus ends chapter 21. Chapter 22. The trio is thrown into a prison outside Frankfurt, which is where Tex learns that Doug and Grandpa Keith are LDS. Even though he's been with Grandpa Keith since basic training and has quite a bond with him, it apparently never came up. They're put to work repairing train tracks, which naturally, isn't hard for Doug. It was difficult work, and the prisoners who didn't put forth a decent effort were beaten mercilessly. I could handle the work fairly well, but the train rides often took an hour each way, and they were unbearable. So working outside in the snow, doing manual labor with no coat, isn't too hard, but standing on the train is unbearable? Then we get some details about everyone's weight that, as usual, emphasize how much better Doug is doing than the others. I'd weighed about 180 pounds during my mission, but now there couldn't be more than 125 pounds on my 6'3" frame. Tex was about 6 feet tall and fairly stocky, but he was also at about 125 pounds. We felt quite healthy, though, compared to Keith, and we were very worried about him. He was shorter and had a slender build, and probably weighed less than 100 pounds. Tex is somehow still described as stocky, despite being 125 pounds, and Grandpa Keith is now just wasting away. His gaunt appearance really scared me. I honestly didn't believe he'd make it without some divine assistance. I'd already given him a blessing after his knee injury, but I felt prompted to ask him if he'd like another blessing. Grandpa Keith says that he would like another blessing. Tex gave us a funny look. What are you talking about? What's a blessing? What do you mean? You've never heard of a blessing before? Every major religion in the world offers blessings. Was Tex drafted from the moon? Well, once he hears about this newfangled thing called a blessing, he wants one too, so Doug gives them to both him and Grandpa Keith. I closed the blessing and settled back down against the cell wall as Tex wiped tears from his eyes. Thank you, Wasatch, he said. I feel good about what you said, and I felt something unusual as you said it, kind of a burning feeling. That warm feeling is the Lord's way of talking to you, I said. No, dude, that's the frostbite. This was the scene when I realized Tex was going to convert, and it adds another layer to Chad's good LDS versus evil everything else dichotomy. A character that isn't LDS can be a good person, but only if they're going to convert later in the story. The last scene in this chapter is one that could have been really moving if told well, but of course Chad fails to pull it off. One morning, the guards inform them that someone tried to sabotage the train, and unless the person who did it turns themselves in, everyone will be held responsible. A prisoner named Ted Bjarnson takes responsibility, and he won't be going home, if you get my drift. He had been captured the same day we had been, and I'd admired his courage. To this day, I don't know if he'd really been part of a plot to destroy the train. Maybe he'd decided to sacrifice his life to save ours. Either way, I'd never forget him. Well, I will, because this is the only paragraph of this entire novel in which he appears. This exact subplot has appeared in countless war movies and books. It's its own trope. And done well, it can be a real tearjerker. But it's impossible for me to care about a character I've never heard of before. He didn't even need to be a major character. There's power in repetition. So even if he just got name dropped 3 or 4 times, just so we know he's around and we get used to him being around, that would create a familiarity that might allow us as readers to feel sorrow at his sacrifice and loss once he's gone. But the way Chad includes him is almost offensive. It's like he creates him solely to try to make us feel bad. It's manipulative. There's something else we now know about Chad. I hope Ted Bjarnson isn't based on a real person, because if he is, he deserved a better fictional representation than this. Thus ends chapter 22. At this point in the story, I want to remind you of 2 things. First, God has sent Doug back in time to make sure that Grandpa Keith lives through the war. Second, Grandpa Keith is dying. So what does Doug do? He abandons Grandpa Keith to the Yahtzees. I'm not kidding. One day, Tex and Doug decide to run off into the forest, and Grandpa Keith says he's too weak to go with them and offers to create a distraction instead, and they agree. Doug had one job, and it was to protect Grandpa Keith. Instead, he runs into the forest while the guards assault Grandpa Keith. And the worst part is, I don't even think Chad realized that what he wrote amounted to Doug spitting in God's face. Doug never reflects on this choice. He never wonders if he did the right thing. He just takes off. So, Tex gets shot through the ankle during their escape, and then they hide under the trunk of a giant fallen tree. We didn't move a muscle for another 5 minutes. Then Tex whispered, "We've got to stop this bleeding. I'm feeling really lightheaded." We moved from under the trunk and back into the hole. Tex laid down in the leaves and I carefully removed his boot. I gasped as I saw the bullet had torn away most of the flesh between Tex's ankle socket and his foot. Miraculously, it wasn't bleeding very heavily. Tex looked down at his ankle, then cursed softly under his breath. I ripped a sleeve off my shirt and wadded it into the wound. Then I tore off my other sleeve and wrapped the injury as tightly as I could. Tex grimaced in pain. "Will we have to cut off my foot?" "No, it doesn't look that bad," I said calmly. In reality, he'd probably die from infection within days. The description of this injury is so inconsistent it defies understanding. It's bleeding so profusely that Tex is getting lightheaded, but it also isn't bleeding very heavily. It doesn't look too bad, but he'll probably die. Also, there's no such thing as an ankle socket. Chad seems to believe there's some sort of empty space between the ankle and the foot, but that space is full of bones. My favorite part of this, though, is Doug tearing off his shirt sleeve. Earlier, he ripped off another part of his shirt to wrap around Grandpa Keith's foot, and I like to imagine him out in the snow, super thin but still really buff, wearing a sleeveless crop top. Doug gives Tex another blessing, and from here on out, Tex only has a limp. They drink some ditch water because, like his sister Emma, Doug doesn't understand safe water basics, and then they wander around the forest for a bit before breaking into an empty cottage. But it's not empty after all. Thus ends chapter 23. The cabin is inhabited by a 15-year-old boy named Daryl and a 17-year-old girl named Ingrid. They're both German, but conveniently speak English, and aren't Yahtzee. Dawn was quickly approaching, and now I could vaguely see the girl's features. Even in the dim light, I could tell she was a beauty. Her tattered gray dress hung loosely on her slim figure, and her dark hair fell lightly over her shoulders. Doug's immediately into Ingrid, but she and her brother asked them to leave. Tex looked at me. "Let's get out of here," he said. "These two seem to be nothing but trouble." "What trouble? You broke into their cottage." For some reason, Daryl and Ingrid decide to let them stay. Ingrid cleans Tex's ankle wound and Doug drools over her some more. Then the German soldiers find the cottage and they all have to hide under the floorboards in a shallow hole that Daryl dug, and Ingrid has to lay on top of Tex. Doug decides that Tex and Ingrid are better off together because they come from the same time period, which might be the first sensible thought he's ever had. Thus ends chapter 24. They all live on stale crackers and watercress for a week. Doug continues to be stronger than everyone else. I couldn't believe how weak I felt, but the others were suffering even more, especially Ingrid. Doug tries to get Tex and Ingrid together, but Tex says he's not good enough for her because he used to steal from a grocery store nearly every week. Sadly, this intriguing statement is never explained. Did he steal food? Did he work at the grocery store? Who knows? Doug starts teaching everyone about Mormonism, of course. But within days, we were in such rough physical shape that I wasn't sure they were even listening at times. Just imagine that you're hiding from Yahtzees, you're slowly starving to death, and the guy you're hiding with won't shut up about his religious beliefs. Tex, Ingrid, and Daryl seem content to starve to death, but not Doug. My frustration was growing, though. I felt I could slip through the forest and find help, but I didn't dare leave these three on their own. Finally, Doug finds out that it's the 7th of May and realizes that the war in Europe will be over the next day. He walks back to the prison they were at and discovers it's being evacuated by Russian soldiers, but he's arrived just in time to say goodbye to Grandpa Keith, who has somehow managed to survive despite Doug abandoning him. Thus ends chapter 25. Doug gets the Russians to pick his friends up and take them to a hospital. Ingrid has lapsed into a coma, and the doctors say she'll be dead by midnight. Doug gives her one of his blessings. The Russians make Doug and Tex get in a truck headed for France, but the driver has been drunk for 2 days and they crash. Somehow Doug is catapulted out of the back and over the truck. Time slowed down as I soared through the air. I glimpsed the jumbled, broken bodies of my fellow soldiers in and around the smashed truck. Then everything sped up again as I roughly landed on my chest, bounced forward 10 feet, then crashed headfirst into a large boulder. Incredible pain ripped through my skull as it cracked against the stone, and I fell among some rocks. My head can't take any more of this, I moaned as the darkness surrounded me. Thus ends chapter 26. As I pointed out in my video for An Errand for Emma, Chad has no understanding of narrative arc. In a time travel story, returning from the past is usually the climax of the story. Doug's goal was to keep Grandpa Keith alive through the end of the war, and the war ended with Grandpa Keith alive, although I don't think Doug deserves the credit. The rest of the book should be wrap-up, and it should be reasonably brief when compared with the rest of the story. But it's not. It's 46 more pages. So, Doug wakes up back in present time after bashing his head again, and he's discovered by 2 U.S. soldiers, because apparently the land he was on is now a U.S. Army base. The soldiers take him to the hospital on the base, where he writes, "Contact the LDS Church" on his admissions form under the health insurance section. He isn't seen by a doctor for 3 days, which is ludicrous. But finally, a doctor comes by, and Doug, like an idiot, tells him that he's been traveling through time. He just blurts it out, just like Emma did. That's the Dalton family curse, not knowing when to shut up about time travel. The doctors say that the soldiers reported that Doug was a vagrant, which really ticks him off. "They found me barely alive at the bottom of a canyon," I said. "Does that sound like a vagrant?" I mean, I don't know. I don't know what that means. Anyway, Dr. Roberts does some research and decides he believes Doug. "I don't know what to say," he said. "This is unbelievable." I laughed and said, "I've got plenty of stories to tell. You ought to study me." Those were the stupidest words I've ever uttered. I honestly think Chad thought that joke was really clever, and that's why he included this entire plotline. Because chapter 28 focuses on how Dr. Roberts holds Doug captive in the hospital in order to study his brainwaves. At one point he does an EEG and then says, "The initial tests showed some really weird stuff," which sounds just like a doctor. Even in my weakened condition, I could have thrashed Dr. Roberts, but then I saw the guard peer around the corner. I was outnumbered. Doug is stuck in the psych ward of the hospital with no phone, and since he didn't bother to call his family during the first 4 days of his stay when he was in the main hospital, he's missed his chance. And now Dr. Roberts goes full-on mad scientist. Dr. Roberts gave me a triumphant smile. Then he backed away and waved his hands in the air. "Scientists have only dreamed of this opportunity," he cackled. "Imagine the value of this data, and imagine what the tabloids will pay for this story." "You're nuts! This is illegal!" I shouted. He quickly threw a hand over my mouth and glanced at the door to make sure no one was coming. I quickly realized no one would respond. Everyone thought I was the crazy one. Why does Dr. Roberts bother to cover Doug's mouth if no one is going to respond because they all think Doug is crazy? Which is it? Dr. Roberts' eyes had become wild, almost possessed. The friendly, skeptical Dr. Roberts I'd first met was gone, replaced by one who was completely convinced I was telling the truth. Now he was going to cash in on it, no matter what. "Doug, you were honest with me, and I'll be honest with you," he said. "You'll never leave here." Yeah, he's going to keep Doug in the mental hospital on an army base for the next 50 or so years, and no one's going to notice. Naturally, God fixes the situation. The guard usually left my door slightly open, and one afternoon I heard a conversation in the hallway. "Hold on there," the guard said. "No one goes in that room." A younger voice said, "Sir, we're here to share the word of God with the sick and afflicted." The guard just laughed and said, "This poor fellow sure fits that description, but no one's allowed to see him." They don't let proselytizing missionaries wander around psych wards talking to patients about God. I'm sure you can get a visit from a priest or a minister if you're stable enough and you request one, but people in psych wards are dealing with enough. They don't need folks trying to convert them. And this is a military base. You can't just walk in. Doug writes the missionaries a note explaining that he's being held hostage and telling them what time the guard shift changes, and they promise to come back at midnight. Dr. Roberts finds out that the missionaries visited, though, and he's ticked. "You can't visit with anyone," he shouted. "It could taint the data." Could it? What exactly is he testing for? Anyway, that's the end of chapter 28. The missionaries return, and one distracts the guard while Doug and the other one run to their car, Doug in his backless hospital gown. Chad actually makes it a point to tell us that. Then Doug just crouches down in the backseat of the missionary's car while they go through the base checkpoint. Easy peasy. The missionaries explain that they prayed about whether or not to break him out, and right afterward they got a call requesting that they locate someone named Doug Dalton, who wrote "Contact the LDS Church" in the insurance section of his hospital admissions form. As usual, God has fixed things. Doug gets to call his mission president, who says that he learned about Doug's time traveling from Doug's parents, because they are both carriers of the Dalton family curse, and they get him on a plane back to America the next day, even though he has no passport, or any evidence he is who he says he is, or pants. Before he leaves, he learns from the front page of a newspaper that Dr. Roberts went crazy and assaulted a hospital security guard, and he's happy. I felt bad for the injured guard, but it felt wonderful to see Dr. Roberts' dreams go up in smoke. Thus ends chapter 29, but before we move on, I want to point out the poor use of this cliche, "dreams go up in smoke." Some people think cliches are the worst writing sin you can commit. Personally, I think they have their uses. Some of them are so ingrained in language that not using them would feel awkward or distracting. And sometimes you want to make sure that the writing doesn't draw attention to itself. Those are great times to embrace cliches. But here the cliche doesn't quite make sense. What it says is that Doug is happy that Dr. Roberts won't achieve his personal career goals. But it makes more sense that Doug is happy that Dr. Roberts is going to lose his job and probably be charged with a crime. Doug flies back to the US and is reunited with his family. "When your missionary companion described the strange way you'd disappeared, we hoped you'd somehow repeated Emma's feat," Dad said. "We couldn't be sure, though. Some nights I'd wake up in a sweat, having dreamed you'd landed in the back of a garbage truck and were now part of a toxic New Jersey landfill." "Dad, that's horrible," I said. "What a bad way to die." He shrugged. "Well, that's pretty much how the police in New Jersey explained it away." Chad really does think that New Jersey is the worst place on earth. Within 2 pages, Doug already starts insisting that he be allowed to return to New Jersey to finish his mission. His mom freaks out and starts crying. I don't really know what the point of this scene is other than to prove to us what a swell guy Doug is. He also wants to visit his grandma Rosalie, whom Emma informs him is dying of cancer. Shocker. Emma also tells him that she's found a publisher for her time travel memoir, although it's being published as fiction. They talk about whether or not further head trauma might send them into the past again, and agree that if one of them gets sent back in time, they'll bury a box of papers explaining their situation 10 feet from the base of a very old tree in their front yard. That way their family will know where they are, when they are, and what they're doing. Thus ends chapter 30. Doug visits his great-grandma Rosalie. When Doug's father called to tell her that Doug had been located in Germany, she somehow figured out that he was the one who mailed her that letter during World War II. She tells Doug that Tex survived the car crash, married Ingrid, and moved to California. They named their kid Keith after Grandpa Keith. Then she points out that Doug's father was given the middle name Doug after his grandfather's war buddy, and Doug was named after his father, so technically he was named after himself. Thus ends chapter 31. Doug goes to a Memorial Day service at the cemetery. He visits Grandpa Keith's grave, but he can't stop thinking about himself, as usual. For the first time, I noticed a small metal marker next to his headstone that noted he was a war veteran. I realized I'd never be honored in that way. So, did you fight in the war for God or for clout? Just asking. After 6 weeks, Doug returns to New Jersey to fulfill his mission. His previous mission companion, Elder Martin, picks him up at the airport. And while they're there, they also pick up the mission president's parents, who just happen to be Tex and Ingrid. That's right. Not only did they live and get married and name their baby after Grandpa Keith, they also converted. This is my favorite part. I noticed Tex had a slight limp, but otherwise you'd never guess his ankle had once been blown apart. Like a hot dog in a microwave. Doug, in true Dalton fashion, blurts out exactly who he is and how he knows them. They're skeptical for about half a page. Then it's all hugs and fond memories. The next part killed me, though. Elder Martin saw Doug fall off the bridge, get rolled over by an 18-wheeler, and vanish. Naturally, he wants to know what happened. Doug asks him what he did after Doug disappeared. I ran to the police station down the block and reported the accident, Elder Martin said. I was pretty devastated for a while, but I carried on with a new companion. After all, the Gomez family was so close to baptism, and I couldn't let them down. We baptized Anna, Lena, and Carmen the following week. They're very active in the church now. That's great, I exclaimed, happy to change the subject. And they never talk about it again. Elder Martin, if you're watching, you lack follow-through. Just a note. Tex and Ingrid and Doug go out to dinner, and Tex and Ingrid promise to bring their granddaughter Becky to a BYU game so Doug can meet her. Thus ends chapter 32. Doug pays one more visit to Anna, the woman whose daughter Elder Martin healed and whose son Elder Martin beat unconscious, and she feeds him fish head soup, because what this book needed was one more dig at regional cooking. Grandma Rosalie dies. Anna's husband, the one Doug thought drank too much and watched too much soccer on TV, shows up to church and attacks Doug with a knife. Chad claims this really happened, but he doesn't explain why this man tried to kill him, either in his autobiography or in this book. Doug says that the bishopric tag-teamed the attacker, because he doesn't realize that a bishopric is made up of 3 people, but a tag team is always 2. No one is hurt, and the attacker is deported. Thus ends chapter 33. Chapter 34. Doug completes his 2-year mission and flies back to Salt Lake City, but he's met at the airport by his grandparents, who deliver bad news. Just a few minutes ago, we were paged to come to the airport's information desk. They said it was urgent. We found out Emma and Tad had been in a serious car wreck, and your parents immediately left for the hospital. Are they dead? I asked frantically. What did they tell you? All we know is that they were in a collision at South Temple and 300 West, right in front of the Delta Center, Grandpa said. As they turned left from South Temple onto 300 West, a car ran a red light and slammed into the passenger side. Oh no, I cried. Who was driving? Tad, Grandma said woodenly. He cracked a few ribs and has some minor injuries, but Emma's head hit the passenger door window so hard she went through the glass, despite wearing a seatbelt. What? You know all that, but no one bothered to tell you if they survived? Delaying giving your readers important information is a legitimate and reasonable way to build tension, but you can't do it while info dumping. Doug arrives at the hospital and learns that Emma hit her head on the window so hard she traveled through time again. Luckily, she and Doug made that agreement to bury a box with a letter in it, so the Daltons grab Tad from the ER and drive home, where they start digging up the yard. But they don't find a box, so the next day, Doug's father rents a backhoe and really digs up the yard. I'm curious what they told the neighbors. Also pretty sure they killed that tree. I can't believe she didn't leave a message, I said. This didn't help us one bit. Yes, it did, Doug, Dad said thoughtfully. I know where she is. What do you mean? Think about it. I shook my head in despair, then leaned on the shovel. I let my mind ponder the circumstances. Then the truth dawned on me as brightly as the August sun shining above me. I caught my breath and whispered, She's in the future. Why? Why would you assume that? There are so many other possibilities. Maybe she got sent back to before the tree was planted. Maybe she got sent back to before the house was built, so she didn't know which tree was the right one. Maybe somebody else was burying a dead pet and found the box. Maybe she didn't have money to buy a shovel, a box, a pen, and a paper. Maybe she tried, but the people living in the house at the time didn't want their yard dug up. This deduction that she must be in the future would make Sherlock Holmes weep. Thus ends chapter 34. We have finally reached the last chapter of this book. So naturally, Chad decides to introduce new characters and a new plotline. Doug goes to the BYU game with Tex and Ingrid, and meets their stunningly beautiful granddaughter, Becky. Becky has a boyfriend, but her grandparents don't like him and keep trying to set her up with other people, while insisting that they do like him. It's totally healthy. I also want to point out that this is a repeat of the time travel cliche from the first book, where Emma falls in love with someone in the past and ends up with their descendant in present time. I don't really understand why Becky decides to go out with Doug. I understand even less why Doug decides to take her to that same cave he took May to at the beginning of this book. And if that's not bad enough, he takes her to the same Subway to buy sandwiches. Becky loves the cave, though, and she tries to catch the mouse to keep as a pet. Chad throws in a casually sexist observation. She'd ordered herself a foot-long sandwich, and I was amazed when she easily ate the whole thing. Then they go to McDonald's and buy French fries, which they feed to some fish at the state hatchery. I can't quite imagine that you can just walk onto hatchery grounds and toss whatever you want into the fish troughs, but that's what they do. Becky casually put her arm around my waist and said, "You're so much fun. We've got to do this again." "Don't let Grandma Brown hear you say that," I said seriously. "She'll reserve a place for our wedding reception." Becky gasped. Then she pushed me hard in the chest. I stumbled a moment before sprawling backward into one of the water troughs. Splash! Those fish never saw me coming. Sounds like another stellar date. The next scene begins. The following week, I went to Becky's apartment, pretending to just stop by. But you did just stop by. Showing up casually is what just stopping by is. What about this was pretend? I don't know, but Doug is irritated to find Becky's boyfriend Chris having lunch with her. Doug and Becky keep sort of dating despite her relationship with Chris. After a few weeks, Doug demands to know how she can date both of them, and she replies, "Maybe we're moving too fast, Doug." That makes Doug mad, and he tells her to forget he called her. He can't wrap his mind around the idea that she might not be that into him, so he comes up with this theory. It bothers me immensely that Becky can't make up her mind, although I realize peer pressure might be part of it. When you're dating a BYU basketball star, how do you explain to your apartment roommates that you're going to dump him in favor of a guy who looks like he's been in a prison camp? Peer pressure? That's what you came up with? I'm making an educated guess here that this is what Chad told himself when women turned him down. If you read between the lines of his autobiography, he didn't have a lot of success with women until he met Tammy. He basically married the first woman who would have him, And while he claims that he never seriously dated anyone else because the Lord always told him not to pursue a relationship, it doesn't really ring true. Doug ends the story by summarizing the state of his life. He's attending BYU and avoiding Becky, and Emma has been missing for 5 months. Thus ends Doug's dilemma. In closing, let's consider how Chad could have improved this book and what we've learned about him. To me, the obvious appeal of the time travel novel is the part where they're in a different time. This book is 176 pages long. Doug spends 80 pages exactly back in World War II. The other 96 pages are spent in the present. That is very out of whack, and there's so much that could have been cut, especially from the first 50 pages. The cave date chapter is begging to be cut. The missionary chapters are an exercise in indulgent narcissism. The only really relevant part before he goes back in time is the chapter where he reads Emma's memoir and his father reassures him that his skull's too hard for him to get sent through time. The entire storyline with Dr. Roberts can go, not to drag a woman with cancer, but I don't feel like we need the Grandma Rosalie subplot. I would say cut the Becky chapter too, except that Doug ends up marrying her and she's in the rest of this series. What I would probably do instead is move her to the beginning of the book. There's no reason she can't be introduced before Doug goes on his mission or back in time. If Doug knows she's off dating Chris, the basketball player, and the longer he's in the past, the more likely she is to marry Chris, that would create an actual source of tension in the book, which would be great. The biggest issue with the book, though, is that at the core, the concept doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense that God would send Doug back in time to make sure Grandpa Keith survives when Grandpa Keith has already survived. And it definitely doesn't make sense that Doug casually abandons his great-grandfather when Grandpa Keith is at his weakest. Finally, this book is called Doug's Dilemma. What dilemma? I read it twice and couldn't find a dilemma. The blurb on the cover says, "A decision to save his friend could erase his own future." When did that happen? Doug never had to decide between Tex and Grandpa Keith. It's nonsense. I think we've confirmed several things about Chad that we suspected after his first book. Namely, Chad has inappropriate ideas about children. The scene where Elder Martin knocks a 7-year-old boy unconscious is outdone only by the following scene where Doug tells Elder Martin he did the right thing. This isn't normal. This isn't a normal thing to imagine or to write. And if Chad included it because he thought it was funny, it's not a normal thing to find funny. There's something grim underlying that scene. Chad's view of people as either good or evil goes even further than I realized in the first book. Here, he makes it clear that as long as people are LDS, they can do no wrong. They can even be Yahtzees. If Wee Mustache had converted to Mormonism, I'm sure Chad would have been on his side too. He also seems to imply that people who are destined to become Mormon are born good. Usually when I see stories about conversion, a character learns about a church or joins a church, and their new relationship with God helps them grow and become better people. But here, people who convert are basically already perfect, and they always instantly recognize the LDS gospel as truth. I think this has nothing to do with Mormonism and everything to do with Chad's lack of understanding of people. He can't create characters that grow and change because he doesn't understand that people grow and change. So he can't imagine his characters before they changed, before they found God. He just writes them like they were always Mormon. So that's Doug's Dilemma by Chad Daybell. As a reminder, please don't reach out to or harass anyone involved in the Daybell case, especially not his or Lori's families. Join me next time for the conclusion of the Emma trilogy, Escape to Zion, in which Emma meets Jesus and wrestles a giant snake. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing, and remember to use your words wisely. Thanks.